Ever get that feeling like something's just off about how we talk about like right and wrong?
Yeah.
Like we're all kind of speaking these totally different languages when we try to talk about morality. Well, that's exactly the kind of territory that we're going to be diving into today with Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue.
Oh, interesting.
We're going to be using the power of AI narration from mindful moments. Nourish your mind on the go to help us like break down this really dense philosophical work
Yeah.
and kind of deliver the key insights in a way that you can kind of ponder anytime and anywhere.
Makes sense.
So get ready to go deep as we explore a world where concepts like justice and virtue, they've kind of become all muddled and confusing.
All right. I'm ready.
It's almost like a forgotten language,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I get that.
Like we know the words, but the meanings have gotten all jumbled up.
Yeah.
So MacIntyre, he really argues that this modern moral discourse, well, it suffers from something that he calls conceptual incommensurability.
Whoa, what a mouthful up.
It's kind of like we're using this like jumble of different moral concepts that don't really fit together all that well.
Oh, I see.
And it leads to these like frustrating debates that just never seem to reach like a resolution.
Yeah, you're right. I've experienced that.
Think about like the last time you got into like an argument with someone online about like a big hot button issue.
Oh my goodness, all the time.
Did you ever feel like you were talking past each other?
Yeah, for sure.
Like using the same words, but you're actually meaning completely different things?
Absolutely.
That's the kind of like moral incoherence that MacIntyre is getting at here.
Interesting.
He uses the example of debates about abortion.
Oh, yeah.
You've got arguments about rights that clash with arguments about universalizability. Then you've got ideas of justice that are pitted against claims of innocence.
Wow, what a mess.
It's just this really confusing landscape. And MacIntyre is suggesting that all this confusion stems from like a much deeper problem.
Okay, what's that?
It's about how we understand the self in the modern world.
Okay, so how do we understand ourselves these days?
Well, he argues that the modern self is very often shaped by this idea called emotivism.
Emotivism.
It's the idea that like moral judgments are essentially just expressions of personal preference.
Whoa, I see.
Like saying murder is wrong. It's basically like saying I prefer pepperoni pizza.
Wow. Okay, so it's all relative.
Yeah, it's like our moral pronouncements, they're not grounded in like any objective standards. And this emotivist self, it kind of shows up in figures that he talks about, like the super efficient manager.
Oh, yeah.
Or, you know, the therapist who treats all values as like equally valid.
Right.
They're operating within systems where morality seems like it's totally separate from their actions.
Or even irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's not even part of the equation.
So how does MacIntyre contrast this with earlier ways of thinking about morality?
Well, to show us a different perspective, he takes us all the way back to these ancient heroic societies.
Okay.
Like the ones depicted in Homer's epics. And in these societies, they had this totally different concept of virtue.
Yeah, how so?
Things like courage and strength.
Uh-huh.
They weren't just like individual qualities.
Okay.
They were actually intertwined with people's social roles and their obligations to the community.
So being a good person was tied to fulfilling your role in society.
Exactly. And think about like the bonds of friendship in Homeric society.
Yeah.
Or their acceptance of fate.
Right.
Or even their approach to death.
Okay, I see it.
These things actually shape their whole understanding of virtue as something that's just inseparable from the fabric of the community.
That's fascinating. So it's like morality was woven into their whole way of life.
Exactly. And while we don't want to like romanticize the past or anything,
Right.
MacIntyre believes we can definitely learn from it.
Okay.
He points to Aristotle's virtue ethics as a potential path out of our current moral confusion.
Okay, so what can we learn from Aristotle?
Well, Aristotle, he really emphasized this idea of telos.
Telos.
It's about understanding our purpose as human beings and striving for excellence, which he called arete.
Interesting.
He also stressed phronesis.
Phronesis, another big word.
It's basically about developing practical wisdom so we can make sound judgments in like real life messy situations.
Right. It's not just about knowing the rules, but knowing how to apply them in real life.
Exactly. And MacIntyre believes that these are skills that we can still cultivate today.
Okay, so we have this framework from Aristotle, but then the world changes pretty drastically after the Greeks.
Right.
So how does the medieval period fit into all of this?
With its knights and chivalry and religious fervor.
Yeah, where does that fit in?
Well, the medieval period, it built upon classical thought, but they also grappled with this whole new relationship between faith and reason.
That makes sense.
Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Alan of Lille, they tried to reconcile the secular and the sacred.
Right.
And this led to some really interesting tensions between individual virtue and societal structures.
Interesting.
And we see this play out in some pretty dramatic historical clashes. Well, you've got Henry II against Thomas Becket. Or centuries later, Henry VIII against Thomas More.
Right.
Each of them represented a different vision of justice and authority, highlighting how this concept of virtue was constantly being reshaped and redefined throughout history.
It wasn't static.
Exactly. It was always evolving.
And this tension, it kind of continues into the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Where thinkers try to develop a purely rational foundation for morality.
That's right.
But MacIntyre, he argues that figures like Bentham and Hume, while emphasizing concepts like utility and pleasure,
Right.
they ultimately fell short in their quest to replace these more traditional understandings of virtue.
It's like they threw out the old system.
Right.
But they couldn't quite replace it with something equally compelling.
That's interesting.
And what's fascinating is how MacIntyre connects all of this to the rise of individualism and these market-driven values.
Oh, I see.
He sees a link between these forces and a decline in our understanding of traditional virtue.
So the market becomes this dominant force, and it kind of erodes our sense of community and shared purpose.
Exactly.
Making it harder to cultivate those virtues that depend on belonging and commitment to something larger than ourselves.
Right.
But how does all of this relate to our lives today?
Yeah, were we just doomed to this moral incoherence?
It can feel that way sometimes.
That's a great question, and it's one that MacIntyre tackles head-on by looking at some surprisingly modern examples.
Oh, really? Like who?
Like Joan Austen and Benjamin Franklin.
Wow, those are interesting choices.
By comparing these classical and medieval lists of virtues with the ones found in Austen's novels, we can see how the concept of virtue continues to evolve. For example, Austen, she emphasizes this idea of constancy.
Okay.
It's something that's not really explicitly addressed in those earlier traditions.
Interesting.
It's like she's highlighting aspects of virtue that might have gotten lost or forgotten amidst all these like broader societal shifts.
Right.
And then you've got Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, yeah. Good old Ben Franklin.
With his famous list of virtues and that whole system for moral self-improvement.
Yeah, that seems pretty relevant today.
Exactly, it does.
So he represents a more individualistic and pragmatic approach to virtue.
Right.
It's tailored to the demands of his time.
Right.
With that focus on worldly success.
Right.
And this contrast between Austen and Franklin, it really highlights how virtues get reshaped across different historical contexts. And this leads us to one of MacIntyre's most important concepts.
Okay, what's that?
Practices.
Practices. What does he mean by that?
And how does this idea of practices help us navigate this really complex moral landscape?
Yeah, I'm curious. So MacIntyre, he uses this word practices to describe activities that have their own like internal goods and standards of excellence.
Okay.
So think about things like playing a musical instrument or being a doctor.
Right.
Or even raising a family.
Yeah.
These aren't just about like following a set of rules.
It's more about striving for some kind of internal good that's like specific to that particular practice.
So it's about more than just going through the motions.
Right.
You're actually aiming for a deeper level of excellence.
Exactly.
Within that specific activity.
Yeah. And MacIntyre argues that virtues are actually essential for achieving those internal goods.
Oh, interesting.
Like you can't be a good doctor without compassion,
right,
or a good musician without discipline, or a good parent without patience.
I see.
These virtues, they're like the tools that allow us to really excel within a practice.
So the virtues are essential for actually being good at something.
Exactly.
It's not just about talent or skill.
Right. It's about character.
Okay.
And MacIntyre, he doesn't shy away from the fact that these practices can sometimes conflict with each other.
Right. I was just thinking that.
Yeah, like the demands of one practice might clash with another.
Yeah, for sure.
Like a doctor who's really dedicated to their patients might have to sacrifice some family time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or an artist who's really passionate about their work might struggle to hold down a steady job.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah, and that's where I think MacIntyre's idea of narrative unity comes in.
Right.
It's about how do we weave all these different practices together with their competing demands into a coherent life?
He argues that our lives are kind of like stories.
Oh, interesting.
A good story has unity and purpose.
Right.
It's not just a bunch of random events.
Okay.
It's like a narrative that unfolds over time with characters developing and making choices.
Right. Like we're the authors of our own lives.
Exactly.
Working within these certain constraints.
Yeah.
Like the demands of our chosen practices.
Right.
And the expectations of our communities.
And this whole idea of narrative unity.
Right.
It's essential for understanding the virtues.
Okay, so.
They're not just these abstract principles.
Okay.
They're qualities that actually help us live out our stories
Right.
in a meaningful and good way.
So the virtues help us become the heroes of our own stories.
Yeah.
Facing these real-world challenges.
Right.
And striving for excellence within our chosen practices.
It's a much more compelling way to think about virtue
Yeah.
than just like blindly following rules.
It makes it sound a lot more active and engaging.
Yeah.
But how do we actually move from these like abstract ideas to some practical application?
Well, MacIntyre argues that virtues are best learned and practiced within communities that share a common understanding of the good.
Cool.
He uses the word tradition to describe these communities, but he's not talking about like blind adherence to the past.
Right. So it's not just about following traditions for tradition's sake.
Right. It's about finding those communities that can actually help us develop our moral character and live out our stories meaningfully.
But what about those who don't really feel like they belong to any particular tradition?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like, where do they fit in?
Well, MacIntyre, he acknowledges that our modern world is becoming increasingly fragmented.
Right.
And a lot of people feel alienated from those more traditional forms of moral authority.
Yeah, I could see that.
He sees this as a serious problem.
Okay, why is that?
Because without a strong sense of community and tradition, it becomes really difficult to sustain the virtues.
So we kind of need those supportive structures.
Yeah.
Those communities that can help us cultivate the virtues.
Right.
And live out those stories in a meaningful way.
Exactly.
But if those communities are eroding, like where do we go from here?
Well, MacIntyre, he suggests that we might actually need to create new forms of community.
Oh, interesting.
What he calls local forms of community.
Other forms of community, okay.
Yeah, it's about finding ways to recover that sense of shared purpose and commitment that are essential for sustaining the virtues.
So not going back to some idealized past.
Right.
But creating something new that can meet the challenges of our present moment.
Exactly. It's a tall order.
Yeah, it is.
But I don't think it's impossible.
It requires like a kind of moral imagination, doesn't it?
Precisely.
Like a willingness to experiment and try new things.
Yeah.
And build new structures that can support a virtuous life.
And that's really what MacIntyre is calling for in After Virtue.
Right. It's not just a critique.
Right.
It's also an invitation to imagine new possibilities.
Exactly.
But it can feel kind of daunting.
Yeah.
Like, where do we even begin to create these new forms of community?
That's a great question, and it's one that we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so stay tuned.
We're going to look at some of MacIntyre's specific suggestions
Right.
for how we might rebuild a more coherent moral language and create those local forms of community that can actually sustain the virtues in our increasingly fragmented world.
So stay with us as we unpack how to translate these really profound ideas into actionable steps for cultivating a more virtuous life in our modern world. Okay, so we've really taken this journey through MacIntyre's critique of modern morality.
Yeah.
Explored the power of those practices and how important narrative unity is.
It's been quite a ride.
But now for the big question.
Big one, yeah.
How do we actually, rebuild a more virtuous world?
Yeah, how do we put all this into practice?
Well, MacIntyre doesn't give us, a simple blueprint or anything.
Right.
But he suggests that we start small.
Okay.
By creating what he calls these local forms of community.
Local forms of community.
He believes that these are like the crucibles where virtues can be forged and sustained.
So like little pockets of virtue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of trying to fix the whole world at once, we focus on those smaller, more intimate spheres, like our families, our neighborhoods, our schools, churches, workplaces.
Yeah, those kinds of places.
Places where people are coming together with a shared purpose.
Makes sense.
And these communities, they don't have to be utopian or anything.
Right.
They can be messy, imperfect, even contentious sometimes.
Yeah, that's real life.
Yeah, but what matters is that they're providing a space for like genuine moral engagement.
Oh, okay.
For like wrestling with those big questions about how to live a good life.
So it's like a training ground for virtue.
Yeah, exactly.
Where we can like learn from our mistakes.
Right.
Support each other.
Hold each other accountable.
Right. Try to be better.
But how do these communities like counter that individualistic ethos that's so prevalent in our time?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, MacIntyre sees them as offering a different vision of what it means to be human.
Okay.
One that's grounded in relationships and shared values.
Right.
And a commitment to the common good.
So it's not just about me, me, me.
Right, it's about us.
Yeah, we're all in this together.
They become these like pockets of resistance against that moral fragmentation.
Interesting.
And they have the potential to create something new and hopeful.
Okay, but creating these new forms of community, it sounds kind of idealistic.
Yeah, it does.
Like, where do we even begin?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Well, MacIntyre suggests that we need to rediscover the importance of storytelling and tradition.
Storytelling, okay.
Yeah, because those are the ways that we pass on values.
Right.
And make sense of our lives.
So it's not just about like abstract principles or moral codes.
Right.
It's about the actual stories that we tell ourselves and each other.
Yeah, the narratives that shape our understanding of who we are.
Right, and what matters.
And those stories, they don't have to be like grand or epic or anything. They can be about everyday experiences.
Right.
Local heroes, family histories, shared memories.
Okay.
What matters is that they embody the virtues that we're trying to cultivate.
So the stories themselves become like a vehicle for transmitting those virtues.
Exactly. And they become the glue that holds communities together.
Oh, that's a nice way to put it.
Connecting us to the past and to each other.
It sounds like a call to action.
Yeah, it is.
To like actively shape our narratives and our communities.
Right.
Rather than just passively accepting this fragmented status quo.
Yeah, we have a choice.
And MacIntyre believes that this is like a moral revolution.
Oh, revolution, okay.
But it's not driven by ideology.
Right.
It's a revolution that starts in the heart. It's about those small, consistent efforts to live well day after day.
Yeah, the little things add up.
Those everyday acts of kindness, those moments of courage.
Yeah.
Those choices to put others' needs before our own.
It's about finding that purpose and connection.
Yeah, to something larger than ourselves.
Exactly. And MacIntyre believes that these seemingly small acts, they actually have a ripple effect.
Oh, wow.
They inspire others.
Oh, yeah.
And they gradually transform our communities.
Wow.
One relationship, one practice, one story at a time.
That's really powerful.
It's challenging, but it's also deeply fulfilling.
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive into after virtue.
It has.
Challenging yet inspiring.
Definitely. What are your final thoughts for our listeners today?
Well, if you're intrigued by these ideas and you want to delve deeper, I highly recommend picking up a copy of After Virtue.
Yeah, it's a great book.
We'll provide a link in the show notes where you can purchase the book if you're interested.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insightful deep dives into thought-provoking works like this.
We're here to help you nourish your mind on the go with mindful moments.
And be sure to share your thoughts on this episode on social media.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Let's inspire each other to live more virtuous and meaningful lives.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into After Virtue.
We'll see you next time.